Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Benjamin Zeiler. I'm a professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies here at the University of Ottawa. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the politics of evaluations in international organizations with Steffen, Eckhard, and Brenda Amaral. Steffen is a long friend of the University of Ottawa, going back to, I think it was 2017, if I remember correctly. And since then, him and I have done a number of projects together, including our latest multi-year SHIRT grant, where we study the acquisition and filtering of local knowledge in UN peace operations. In his presentation today, Steffen will talk about his latest book, which is the same as the title of this panel, The Politics of Evaluation in International Organizations, which was published by Oxford University Press. He is a professor of public administration and public policy at Zeppelin University in Germany. He's also affiliated with the Center for Excellence, the Politics of Inequality, just right across the lake at the University of Constance. And he's also a fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. In his research and teaching, he focuses on the management and public organizations and how they make an impact on politics and society within the nation state, but also internationally. And his research projects cover a variety of topics, really, including public service encounters at street levels, studying sort of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts, administrative crisis management, and international public administrations in global public policy making, which is the area of research studies I'm talking about today. He studied political science and administrative science at the University of Constance, Grenoble, and Stockholm. And Steffen will start off with a brief presentation on the sort of key findings and sort of follow-on research that has occurred since the publication of the book. And then Brenda Amaral will join us and provide some comments and some personal reflections on her experience in working in on some of these organizations that Steffen has been studying sort of from an academic point of view. And this will be the nice bridge between sort of academic research and more sort of practical policy oriented research. She's also a new friend of the University of Ottawa. We met a couple months ago or so at a workshop in Geneva. And she currently works for the United Nations in the Policy and Best Practice Services of the UN Department of Peace Operations, where she leads on knowledge management and guidance development in UN peacekeeping, including analyzing and sharing lessons learned in different sort of peacekeeping context, with the goal to increase its effectiveness. Now, I must note that Brenda today is speaking as a researcher and personal private peace-building practitioner. She's not speaking in her capacity as a UN official, so anything that she says today cannot and should not be counted as either official UN policy, position, or any inferences thereof. So that was a sort of quick and brief introduction. And without further ado, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And I will turn it over to Steffen for his introductory remarks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Benjamin. It's a pleasure to be here today. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for the kind introduction. And I'm really glad, Brenda, that you also took the time to be here to comment and to provide your practitioner's perspective, as we like to say in the academic ivory tower. So I wasn't really sitting in the ivory tower while doing the research for this book. It's been a book that came as something that evolved out of a lot of conversations. So we do blend in this research qualitative empirical work, where we've been doing more than 120 interviews with people working in international organizations, so colleagues of Brenda, but we haven't spoken at the time, also because UN peacekeeping isn't one of the organizations we studied. And therefore, it's, I think, really a good setup that you're commenting on this research while working in an international organization that hasn't been one of the cases that we did study in the book. So there are no kind of interferences. All right, so let me try to share my screen. question over to Benjamin and Brenda. Does that work? Can you see everything? All right, perfect. So this is a talk on a book that was published last year by Oxford University Press, The Politics of Evaluation in International Organizations. And the book for me goes back to an interview that I did many years ago at NATO headquarters, where one of the interviewees on a totally different subject said something like a quote that said, there is no objective information out there. When somebody of our member state says the world is flat, then the world is flat, right? So there is no objective information out there. And this made me really thinking about the question, what is it about evidence in international organizations? And that's somehow this research on the politics of evaluation came to be. I'm going to present findings, empirical work that we did for the book, but there are also academic articles that we published alongside. So one of them has appeared only a few months after the book. On the last slide of the presentation today, there will be a summary of the sources that I'm using. So it's not only the book, it's also one or two academic articles that come on top of that. Okay, what is this all about? So the book is about evaluation, about the politics of evaluation, and here you can see one of these evaluation reports as they are published by international organizations, also by domestic organizations out there. It is defined as a systematic assessment that's conducted impartially of an activity, a project, a program, strategy, or whatever, something like this. So research-related, research-like work typically published in these branded publications. Some of them are only 20 pages long, others are 200 or 300 pages long. Evaluation has been on the rise in international organizations. UN Secretary General Guterres said a few years ago that we do need a culture of evaluation, independent and real-time evaluation with full transparency. So there has really been the growth of an evaluation culture in international organizations. The OECD, which I have here, a short icon or logo, was one of the drivers of evaluation standards in international organizations. And in the UN system, a group of an evaluation group was founded a few years ago. They published a code of conduct for evaluation in the UN system. So kind of generalizable norms and standards have been evolving on evaluation in the UN system. Why has all this happened? That's maybe the first question that we should look into. And the real driving force of this, you can see here on the slide. So there was a rise of voluntary funding, voluntary member state contributions in the UN system that began already in the 1970s, 1980s. But the big growth of UN voluntary funding has happened only in the 2000s or since the 2000s. So the slide goes only to 2017, but if we extend this further, you will see that the share of voluntary funding, so funding that is not in the core assessed budgets of international organizations, that is also more flexible for member states to provide in 1 year and to withdraw in another year. This share of funding has really skyrocketed, and this has affected the way how international organizations operate. Obviously, this kind of voluntary flexible project funding requires or is linked to questions about what happens to the money, what happens to the projects that are being funded. And that's why the growth of evaluation happened roughly at the same time. So you can really see that only a few years after the rise of voluntary contributions in the UN system, you can see that the number of evaluation reports in the UN system started growing as well. So currently we have been reaching a plateau at around 1,500 or 2,000 evaluation reports that are being published every year. It is the range of funding that goes into these reports really varies. There are some that only cost 30 or 40,000 US dollars, but some of these reports are also really expensive, up to $500,000 US dollars. So these are really huge research projects. It's difficult, therefore, to establish or calculate an overall number. We tried to calculate one in the book, but I wouldn't, dare putting that out anymore. Anyhow, it's become a huge industry. A lot of consultancy firms, but also academics. I don't know, maybe there are people in this room who've been doing academics, who've been doing evaluation as consultants. But it has become really a huge industry, and that of course raises questions about maybe sort of the institutional standards of evaluation. We asked the question, is evaluation really a gold standard for institutional assessment and learning in the book? This is one of the perspectives that you do find in the literature, one of the maybe extreme perspectives, that evaluation is used for transparency, for accountability, learning. It does enable evidence-based policymaking. Some of my colleagues go so far as to call it a gold standard of institutional assessment at the international level. So evaluation as part of this policy cycle idea, where projects are implemented and then they are evaluated afterwards, and policies are adjusted on the basis of the findings that the process produces. But there's also another perspective out there in the literature, and that's what we call the politics of evaluation. An old colleague of mine from public administration, who's unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he argued that evaluation and organization are contradictory terms. So it doesn't really work that organizations, specifically public organizations, create mechanisms to criticize themselves. There is research, survey-based research from the American Evaluation Association, where evaluators report that they are constantly pressured in their work by their they have to misrepresent their findings and to make them either look more positive or more negative. So these findings and these reports do exist. And there's also indicative evidence for these dynamics in international organizations, but it's more or less has been anecdotal. So there are sometimes reports that politics are in the game. So evaluations are misrepresent what's happening in projects. They are used for political bargaining and in the decision-making bodies of international organizations. But as I said, no really strong, consistent evidence across organizations. And this is where our book came in, right? To answer the question, can we say that evaluation is used for these functional purposes, or do we see a lot of evidence for the politics of evaluation in international organizations? So for that, we did create what we could call an analytical framework. And I'm trying to walk you through, so you can call this the micro-mechanisms of the potential politics of evaluation. So it all begins with the question, are there any systematic interests among the stakeholders in the evaluation processes? And there are two main stakeholders. One of them is the bureaucracy, the administration. They do have vested interests. The literature in public administration is relatively certain that public organizations, people working in these organizations have an interest to portray their work in a very positive light, to expand their activities on that basis. So this is an institutional interest. If I'm a manager in a public organization and I would want to make a career, obviously I do need to perform well, and evidence that shows that I've been failing on some occasions doesn't really help down that road. So this is maybe a simplified assumption, but it is one that is established fairly well in the literature. When we look at member states, which is the other group, actor group that we are looking at, they do the opposite. They seek to prevent bureaucratic drift or bureaucratic budgetary expansions. There are also more fine-grained interests when you think about individual policy initiatives where states might want to use evidence that fits their individual objectives. But there are also vested interests when it comes to these evaluation processes. So our expectation is that these stakeholder political interests, and this is the political decision-making body that start on the left side seeks to illustrate, that these political dynamics do affect the level of the evaluation system. So in organizations, the evaluation system typically consists of an evaluation unit, a unit in the organization that oversees evaluation, the conduct of evaluation. Typically, the evaluation units commission evaluations outside the organization. So they hire individual experts who then work individually or together with the team consisting of people in the evaluation unit jointly on the evaluation reports. So this is the level of the evaluation system. And we do argue that the stakeholder political interests affect the way how the evaluation system is designed in international organizations. And I'll explain how that design influence looks like later on. But for now, we can just memorize that there is an impact from the political level to the level of the organization, the design of the evaluation systems. So if there are biases in the way how the evaluation system is designed, our expectation is that this should also have implications for the individual reports, or the individual evaluation reports. And how that looks like will be part of the presentation later on. And if there are biases in the evaluation report, so if they either lean towards the member state interests or towards the bureaucratic interests, this should have implications for the way how the findings in evaluation reports are used in the political decision-making processes of international organizations. So this is the theoretical model that we're behind. We're expecting a political use in case that either the administration or member states are controlling the evaluation system exclusively, and we expect a more functional use towards learning in the case when they jointly control the evaluation system. That's our basic expectation for this research. Now let's go into the actual empirics. What have we been doing here? This is a mixed method research design, as you could call it. We do apply a combination of qualitative research and quantitative research. The core of it is a comparative study of 21 organizations in the UN system. They are on the slide on the right side. Each of these organizations has established an evaluation unit. They all do evaluations, not in the same numbers, but they all publish evaluations. They are otherwise fairly diverse in terms of their mandates, in terms of their size, in terms of their budgets. So rather diverse group of organizations, but they all share the same evaluation policy that works system-wide, and therefore we can somehow compare them or treat them as a comparable class of cases. We've collected data from 120 semi-structured expert interviews with member state representatives, officials in the evaluation units, and officials in the IO administrations. There is a qualitative analysis of evaluation policies and a quantitative and qualitative analysis of evaluation reports. The largest number of reports that we've studied is more than 1,000 of these reports, and we've used quantitative text mining methods for this procedure, as I'll explain later on in the presentation. So let's look at the first expectation. As I said, we do expect that member states and the administration have vested interests in in evaluation. So this should affect the way how the evaluation units are designed, and also the evaluation units, how they orient themselves, either towards the administration, the management of the organization, or towards member states. This is how now the example of UNDP, an organizational chart. In that organizational chart, you find sort of the regular structure here in the middle. And on the left-hand side are some cross-cutting units, such as the Ombudsman, the ethics office, but also the evaluation unit, the independent evaluation office. And you can already see in the name that this is supposed to be a formally independent unit in the organization because it does these checks and balances. But of course, even though it's supposed to be formally independent, if we do look at the organization, it's clear that it is not fully unchecked or not fully independent, because somebody needs to appoint the head of the evaluation unit. Somebody needs to make a decision on that. Somebody needs to take the decision on the budget that the evaluation unit gets, and somebody needs to make a decision on the agenda settings, or which projects are being evaluated every year. So these decisions are taken, and when you look in the evaluation policies, and this was the first very interesting and I must say striking finding that motivated this entire research project, we did find out that there is great variation across these 21 international organizations, and this is what you can see here. So we did look into the evaluation units. You see the organizations, and everything that goes to the right tells us that the three components that have just been mentioned, so the staff appointment, the budget, and the evaluation agenda, is either controlled by member states, so that's on the right side, or the top organizations here, or this is controlled by the administration, or there's a mix of both. There are some organizations, middle ground organizations, where both member states and the administration, the management of the international organization are involved in the appointment of the head of the unit, in the budget decisions and the agenda setting. But there are two so in the end, we end up with three fairly similar sized groups that are differing in terms of how their evaluation system is designed informally. Yeah? And our expectation is that this should also affect the way how these units position themselves in terms of whom they perceive as the sponsor or the sort of their main client. This is one of the first findings that we also got from our interviews. Here's a quote of a head of an evaluation unit in a member state dominated international organization that is representative for this dynamic. So he said, she said, I work hard to get a close relationship with the board. I need to have them close to me to have their support of what I do. In the end, they are the ones who can force the administration to do something. I do not have any power myself, but a governing body basically has the power to push the management. So you can really see, and this runs through a lot of the interviews that we did, that there's a clear orientation towards the member states in these kinds of organization. And here's the opposite example of an organization where where the administration dominates the evaluation unit. Sometimes we discover critical issues, things that are completely out of control and not working. We really bring them up to the management immediately. We do that because sometimes it would be very difficult to include it in the report, even from the ethics perspectives, and so on. So it shows that they do perceive the management, the administration, more as the owner, the client, the customer whom they serve in these examples. And that's a consistent theme. We collected a lot of quotes, and we do believe that the evaluation units themselves are not fully aware that there are these sort of informal differences, these differences in orientation across the UN system. At least this is not something that anybody told us in their interviews, that there are sort of, different setups where organizations either orient towards member states or the administration. I think this is something that is still somewhat hidden to these experts. So the last interesting observation is that there are not only these differences in the orientation of the evaluation unit, but there are also differences in the location of the commissioning process of the evaluation. Sometimes this is done by the evaluation unit, read here, and sometimes this is done by other offices in the organization. So the country offices, for instance, or some other functional offices. In these cases, when the evaluation unit is only remotely involved in the evaluation process, so when it is commissioned by a country office in Malawi, for example, these are the cases when the administration has the highest level of control over the evaluation report. That's also where we expect that the biases in terms of the evaluation reports should be highest. Okay, so I think that has cleared all questions on the evaluation system level. We can now proceed to the level of the evaluation reports. Do these dynamics that we've just observed at the level of the system, of the evaluation unit design, these two different groups, does this influence also the evaluation reports? That's the question that we will answer next. And here we did formulate three actually hypotheses. The first one would be that evaluation reports in evaluation systems controlled by the administration should in the end be more positive in terms of the findings, systematically more positive in terms of the findings. Remember that we assume that administrations are interested in a positive self-portrayal. So we do expect that if they control the evaluation reports and if evaluators are aware that they are serving administrative interests, then we should systematically see a tendency towards more positive reports in these cases. The other conflicting, opposing expectation is that the other expectation is that if the evaluation reports are commissioned directly by decentralized units, so the country office in Malawi, to continue with that example, we should also see more positive reports coming out of that. And the last expectation, because we are not only looking at the positivity of the findings, the way how they self-portray themselves, we might see recommendations in these reports that systematically favor the interests of the administration. And these interests could be either an expansion of the resources or a reduction of oversight arrangements. That's the expectations that we do formulate as hypothesis. Now, the next question, and here we need to start a short excursus, is how can we extract performance scores from evaluation reports? This is a rather difficult question because these evaluation reports, remember how I've been introducing them at the very beginning of this talk, are lengthy text-based documents. And in most organizations, they do not come with a school grade that says like the activity was graded overall at a level from 1 to 6 or 1 to 10. So these scores exist, but only for the World Bank, at least publicly. Some organizations might have them, but not publish them. What we get is only the text. So how can we compare the text of evaluation reports to assess whether these reports are more or less positive? And for this, we have been using text mining methods, and that's what my excursus now will be about. So how can we extract the performance scores from these evaluation reports? So remember that the evaluation is defined as a systematic assessment of an activity, such as a program or a project. And when you do look into the reports, you do realize that these assessments do take place at the level of individual sentences. And these sentences, they can either make a positive assessment about the evaluated activity, they can make a negative assessment, there can be descriptive text, or there are recommendations. That's the 4 categories of text that we typically see. So here are a couple of examples. Positive assessment sentence is, the project was found to be successful in forming a partnership. A negative assessment is that FAO has not systematically used its recognized knowledge of the agricultural sector. A descriptive text is, the primary goal of the evaluation was to assess the performance of the World Water Assessment Program. And then there are recommendations. They typically go like this. By the end of 2019, UNHCR should expand their partner pilot with livelihood plans. So these are different types of sentences. When we code an individual evaluation report, could look like this. So we do have a lot of neutral text, descriptive text, and then there are sort of sentence or assessment areas where the report typically argues whether something has been successful or has been rather problematic. And sometimes everything is green, sometimes everything is red, sometimes it's a mixture of both. And our expectation is that the share of negative to positive sentences in the evaluation reports should give us information on the performance that is being assessed here. So it should basically convey the meaning that a reader would also get when he or she reads a lot of negative sentences. Obviously, this is a project that has maybe not had the same level of success as one where we see a lot of successful or positive sentences. So that's basically the main sort of starting point here, to classify sentences into these 4 categories and then calculate the share of positive to negative sentences. This is our data. So we did look at 9 international organizations. We selected all reports in a given time frame. This is the time frame where the current at that time evaluation unit was valid. So it has been sort of a 2, 3, 4 years time frame. We selected all reports that we could get from these 9 organizations. 3 of them do fit into or falls into each of the groups: member state controlled, mixed system, or administrative control. And we have what you see here in black and gray are either centralized or decentralized reports. So the evaluation unit has been commissioning these reports, or the Malawi country office and its peers. Overall, in these 1,082 reports were more than 1 million sentences that we needed to classify. And you can already imagine that this goes beyond what we can ask our student assistants to do. Even if we're sitting at a university with huge resources, 1 million sentences is a big favor to ask, and you won't find a lot of people who are eager to do that. So what we've been doing is we use a pre-trained language model. So deep learning-based language model. These are the predecessors of what we currently know as ChatGPT or GPT-4. These models can do two things. They can either generate text. That's, I think, what most of us have seen recently since the introduction of ChatGPT. And the other task, which they were originally used for and existed also much longer, is classification. They can do all kinds of classification. A lot of these models have been used for image classification. But yeah, in 2018, the first sort of larger language model, BERT, was published. That has been also used for purposes of text classification. So these language models do exist. They are pre-trained, they're out there, they're pre-trained on Wikipedia articles. I think everybody has a bit of an understanding now what language models are. And we can fine-tune them to specific classification tasks. So in our case, we asked our student assistants to label 6,500 sentences from 180 evaluation reports. So they've labeled all these sentences in the three groups: positive, negative, neutral. That's what we've been mostly interested in. We discarded the recommendations for this purpose here. We used 90% of this data to fine-tune the language model, and we used the remaining 10% to evaluate how accurate it classifies. And we found out that it can classify sentences with an accuracy of 89%. So 89% of all sentences that it hasn't seen are classified correctly. And this is, for a language model, pretty good standard. So we've continued with this, using it on our 1 million sentences, and then classified basically the entire data set. And in order to figure out whether we are truly measuring what we're interested in, we went to reports from the World Bank. This is what you can see here. The World Bank provides a human score, so a human provided score that falls into the categories of highly unsatisfactory, unsatisfactory, moderately unsatisfactory, then satisfactory, and highly satisfactory. So 6 classes. And when we compared it with our language model, we see that there's 60% overlap between the two, close to 60% overlap. And if we control for a few factors, this goes up to 70% overlap. This is, I'd say, for us, was sort of the starting point for all of this, because there is, of course, a little bit of variation, but you can't really say whether this is because of the humans who would provide the World Bank score, or whether this is because of our method. I think there are arguments in both directions. You can also say that classification of sentences provides actually a more accurate understanding of what's in a report compared to a human who reads the report and then gives sort of a rule of thumb assessment grade. So anyhow, this is the method that we used to classify the sentences, and now we can go on or come back to our 3 hypotheses. I can show you the data here. So these are our 9 organizations and the various evaluation reports and the share of positive sentences. So you see it's a nicely regular distribution that we're looking at here overall. Let's just jump into the findings. So what you see here is the results for the 3 clusters. So the administrative controlled organizations are on the left side. The mixed evaluation systems are at the middle, and the member state controlled organizations are on the right side. These are box plots. So the lines show the median, and the rhoibuses show the mean. Overall, you can see that our expectations are not fulfilled. So the expectation was that we should systematically see more positive sentences. So the mean on the left box plot should be highest, followed by the mixed group, and then member states should be lowest. But this is not what we find, right? We do find differences between the 3 groups, but they are not linked to our theoretical expectations. So the conclusion here would be that the control over the evaluation system that does not influence the evaluation reports. This is, however, different when we classify the reports as to whether they are commissioned by the central evaluation units. This is the right box plot here, the white one, or the gray one, which is decentralized. So by the Malawi country office and its peers. And there you can see that there is a systematically, and it's also statistically significant differences between the 2 groups of 9 percentage points. So the evaluation reports published by the decentral units contain, on average, 58% positive assessments compared to 43 with the centralized evaluation units. So this for us is a strong indication that in the case that reports are commissioned in the country offices and its peers, that we then do see more positive evaluation outcomes, and this is a strong indication for the kind of evaluation biases that we were expecting. We continued with the text-based research, but with a smaller group of reports, only 120, because here we had to do hand coding to look at the recommendations. And again, we're comparing groups of organizations. On the right side, these are the groups that are member states that are administrative controlled. We were looking at the resource implications of the evaluation recommendations. So as to whether they were recommending an expansion of resources, a reduction of resources, or a maintenance of the status quo. And you can see that the share of expanding resources recommendations is really highest, and it's by far higher than in the other groups in those organizations that have the administration as the controlling entity over the evaluation system. So this speaks very much, or is very much in line with our theoretical expectations. So when the administration controls the evaluation units, the recommendations tend to favor administrative interests. And the same goes for the control implications. We were coding whether the recommendations suggest an increase in oversight over the administration, or whether they suggest no increase in oversight of the administration. And again, when you look at the member state, at the administrative controlled groups, you see that the share of recommendations for no increase is highest in these categories. So this is really what we were expecting. So overall, we can say mixed findings. We don't see that the positivity of the reports is influenced when member states or the administration control the evaluation unit, but we do see that the recommendations are affected. Okay, we can now go back to the level of the political decision making. We've been talking now about the evaluation system. Then we talked about, I explained how this affects the evaluation reports, and now we go back to the sort of use of these evaluations in the decision-making bodies of international organizations. And I'm going to share a few quotes that demonstrate that the dynamics that we observe at the level of the evaluation system also affect the decision-making. So this is again illustrative review quotes that represent a larger group of statements. So here is a member state dominated international organization, and a board member in that organization explained how they used the recommendations of the independent evaluation office to actually say, we clearly have some evidence suggesting that this should be addressed in a more comprehensive or coherent manner by this agency. So there is this kinds of checks and balances through the board structures in terms of seeing how they are progressing. So in this organization, it's really member states who are seeing the evaluation as a tool that they can use to control the organization, the administration, and to provide it with direction. And the problem is that these kind of evaluation systems really lead to a clash in terms of the evaluation unit and the management. Here's another quote from somebody working in that organization, or somebody from the administration, an IO staffer, who said that the board is really perceived as a fighting ground, the boxing ring, where management and the evaluation office would settle their scores. So an alienation of the evaluation function from the administration. And our conclusion in the book is that these systems, when evaluation units are really sort of leaning towards member states, are not ideal grounds for this function as a learning tool, because it kind of alienates with the administration over time, as you see more and more evaluations being really used to punish the management, to drag the management into the board and tell them, like, you failed here and there, and this is not how you can ideally use the evaluation function in a way that helps learning processes. In this example, we have an administrative dominated international organization. The IO staffer here said, if we talk about potential resistance or hesitation of engagement, then I think looking at the facts and providing evidence is one of the key tools to actually mobilize actors. So they do use evaluation when there is no interest among member states to come to a conclusion, to come to a decision. So this person went as far as to say that I would say it is evidence management and policy influence what we do with evaluation. So here you can really nicely see, and maybe this is like, you know, a strong example from the quotes that we collected, but it, you know, brings this argument really to the point that in this example, the administration does use the tool of evaluation strategically in these decision-making, in the decision-making processes. The ideal case is a mixed evaluation system. Here, another quote that hopefully brings this across. So the IO staffer said that draft evaluations are usually presented to the secretariat, but then if you have evaluations of major programs, say in culture or so, and you have the intergovernmental bodies from conventions, then you share the draft conclusions with them. You will get some feedback from member states also. It is, of course, in the interest of the evaluation unit and the evaluators that member states accept it, because if you present an evaluation to the governing body and the governing body rejects the recommendations, it's no good idea either. So in these systems, we do see that the evaluations units orient to both the administration and the member states, and they're trying to balance these interests, trying to get them both on board. And this is what we see as the ideal setup for the design of the evaluation units in international organizations. So let's jump towards the conclusions. I'm finished with the evidence that I have to present in this initial presentation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that might follow from this. So the first concluding argument is that, yes, we do show evidence in this book and related academic publications that the institutional design of international organizations moderates the politics of evaluation. So the politics are always there, right? The interests, stakeholder interests among member states and the administration, they are there, they exist. We can't really change that. But the institutional design is what matters, because it either allows these interests to capture the evaluation units or not. This is, I think, something that we were clearly able to see. We were also able to see that evaluation units are able to maintain their independence when it comes to the findings of the evaluation reports, but not the recommendations. Yeah, so this is the evidence that I've shown in the middle ground. A problematic case is when the evaluations are commissioned not within the evaluation units, but somewhere else in the organization. And this is really worst practice. This should be avoided in the future. Evaluations units should take control over the evaluation processes, full control. And the practice of commissioning the evaluation somewhere else in the organization is problematic. That's the second key piece of evidence that we do show. We think that the dynamics that we've observed, some evaluation units leaning towards member states, others leaning to the administration, is a reason for why evidence-based policymaking in some organizations is perceived as something that is really politicized. So there's a lot of research on this evidence-based policymaking, also using survey, comparing organizations, not only in the international system, but also in domestic organizations. And you can see great variation. In some organizations, this works fine. In other organizations, it's really perceived as politicized. And we do believe that the institutional design of the evaluation system is the key reason for that, as I've shown in this presentation. And the last argument clearly is that we should go towards international organizations, should work towards changing their policies in terms of the resource implications towards the mixed control cluster. You see the member states cluster here on the right side, the administrative control cluster on the left side. There are organizations in the middle, and this is the key recommendations of this book, how organizations, international organizations should change their evaluation designs. That's it. Here's an overview of the sources that I was using. It's not only the book, but it's also two academic articles. The middle one establishes the method to extract performance scores. And the last one has the argument about how the performance scores differ in the different international organizations. Thank you very much. I'm gonna end sharing my slides, and I look forward to our exchange.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Steffen, for this very insightful presentation, a very stimulating presentation that I'm sure will raise lots of questions. Apropos questions for the audience, I know there's lots of academics in the audience, but also policy makers / practitioners. Before I turn it over to Brenda, I just wanted to mention that after Brenda's comments and suggestions, we'll open a question and answer session. So please post your comments in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to your questions and get them answered shortly after Brenda finished. Without further ado, Brenda, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Benjamin. Thanks for inviting me to join. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And Steffen, congratulations on the book. I found it really insightful and also really impressive what you've done and the methods that you've used. And I think it's a really great opportunity to reflect on this important topic. I think what I'll do is I'll briefly explain my role, because I think that might be helpful for all the guests listening today. Also because I'm not actually an expert on evaluation. I work on organizational learning, so I'll explain that a little bit. And then after that, I'll make a few points reflecting on the book, the presentation, and also specifically in the peacekeeping context, in which some of these dynamics that you highlighted also play out, as well as some other thoughts that I have based on my experience with evaluations. So yeah, as I mentioned, I work on organizational learning in peacekeeping, which in that context refers to the methods and tools that we have to capture, analyze, and share lessons and best practices from our operations, then to feed these back into policy and guidance, and also roll these out through training standards and other types of training, for example, pre-deployment training before troops deploy to missions, or in mission training. So this is sort of an ongoing cycle with the main objective to make our missions more effective, to learn, to improve how we implement our mandates. And for me, evaluations are a very important part of this cycle, but they're also really one tool of many. And there is also, in terms of organizational learning, the evaluation is important, but to me equally important is what happens after that, right? What do you do with it? What's the follow-up? How does this, what happens in policy development, etc. So just wanted to put that out as sort of the perspective from which I come and yeah, sort of think about these issues. As you highlight in the book and in your presentation, Steffen, there is indeed an enormous amount of resources that go into evaluations in international organizations. And I really think peacekeeping is no different, even though we were not one of the case studies that you mentioned. But I think it also shows the real importance that we attach to evaluation and to continuously assessing our performance. Maybe I'll say a few words also about the evaluation landscape in peacekeeping, and sort of try to compare where we sit in terms of, the example that you gave, sort of IO-controlled mechanism versus member state controlled. And I think it's really a little bit of a mixed picture. And looking just at evaluations might not fully do it justice. Indeed, the formal evaluation function is within the administration, though it's outside of our department, but it is within an office within the UN secretariat called the Office of Internal Oversight Services. But then there's also a fairly recent policy that actually requires secretariat entities to conduct at least one self-evaluation per year. But then also looking at member state instruments, there is something called a board of auditors who conduct audits of programs and mandates. And those reports are, at least in the way I perceive them, very similar to evaluations. And they come with recommendations on sort of policy changes and operational adjustments, etc. We also have independent reviews that are conducted on missions. We have a number of internal learning tools, such as lessons learned reports and after action reviews and boards of inquiry. So there's really a broad landscape of tools that we have to try and draw lessons and provide recommendations. And I think it is important perhaps also to mention, because sometimes I feel like even the absorption capacity that we have, right, to just like follow up on all of those recommendations. And so it does raise a question about that. There is really like a big volume of reports that are generated with lessons, and there is a lot to assess, right? I also really want to make that point, but it really like becomes something that really the entire sort of bureaucratic system is responding to. And sometimes if you just look at sort of an individual unit or even an individual within that organization, it may appear that all you do is responding to recommendations from different sort of evaluations and other reports, etc. So I think that's also sometimes what you can see. And then I also want to highlight that that really let me go to then how the politics play out, right, in some of in what I at least see from my perspective. So again, peacekeeping, we don't only value evaluations because it's important. I also think peacekeeping is unique in so many ways. We have an annual budget of around $7 billion. We have 11 peacekeeping missions deployed all around the world. There's a huge amount of money that goes into peacekeeping, but also we deploy in extremely fragile and conflict or post-conflict environments, traditionally with mandates to monitor ceasefires or form a buffer between warring parties. But I think as many of you know on the call, like increasingly the mandates of peacekeeping missions have expanded and have become more complex, with more mandated tasks added to it. Implementation, monitoring the implementation of a peace agreement, advanced state building goals, mandates such as protection of civilians. So we deploy both in complex settings with very ambitious mandates, with end states that are not always very clearly defined and sometimes difficult to achieve if they are. So the importance really to assess how peacekeeping missions are doing and how we sort of course correct, I think is really, really important. So your text, your research, I think found one of the things you mentioned was internally led evaluations more often call for resource expansion, right? And that member states led sort of mechanisms or controlled mechanisms, they go more towards resource optimization and control, which I thought was really interesting. And I was also quite pleased to see that your research didn't find necessarily the systematic biases to show positive impact or to sort of hide away a negative impact. And I think that resonates. And I'm not just saying that because that's in my interest working for a public administration, but also based on my experience with lessons learned, I am convinced that is the case, that even if you're part of an organization, we do really value the importance of doing frank assessments of a response to a certain event or a certain project or the implementation of a mandate, because there is a genuine desire, I think, across many colleagues, many practitioners to do better. And again, also very much related to this idea that I mentioned in the beginning, we deploy to do things that are quite unique, I think, and we recognize that we might not get it exactly right the first time, or there may be many different factors that need to take into consideration. And we're also doing this in a really rapidly evolving kind of context. But of course, we are highly aware of the political factors that play out in the peacekeeping context, including in evaluations. This can be because, you know, sometimes topics are extremely sensitive. And I think in that, from that, building on that point, even sometimes looking at areas that don't get evaluated might even tell you something sometimes. But it could also be that there is the belief that there is a certain agenda behind the recommendation. And I think the more strategic you go, the more sort of at the strategic or higher level, the more the politics get into it. And perhaps further down to, you know, really a project level, you might find that a little less, though I don't think in either it's extremely, it's completely excluded. But I think two things. I think, nevertheless, I don't think that therefore we shy away of trying to address issues in evaluations that are politically sensitive. I think there is still a lot of scope to do that. You just kind of have to know how. And, you know, this is, I think, being part of an international public administration and understanding the politics. I think a lot of colleagues, if you would ask, would see this part and parcel of their work, and not in a way of sort of, you know, trying to kind of, you know, get what you want by scheming, and not in that kind of a way, but just by understanding that there are political realities and that you have to navigate those in order to effectively implement our mandate, or in order to foster a change that we think is needed. So I do think that's the case. I do think the point, Steffen, that you make about also being really aware of you know, the politics and the institutional design, for example, is really important. And second, I also think that, you know, even despite what you found in terms of the recommendations, I still think they can be extremely effective, both in terms of, you know, the analysis that are out there in evaluations and the recommendations themselves. Maybe also another nuance that I wanted to bring to that sort of like member state interest versus administration interest, I think is also something that requires a nuance, right? Because even within member states, you'll find that there are diverging interest or differing interest among member states. And on the other hand, within the administration, certain units or certain departments might trying to achieve different things. So I think that's also something that if you would maybe really dig into individual cases, that you find sort of all these added nuances to this point. A final point that I wanted to make before I hand it back to Benjamin is also, so really this point really started to make me think about evaluation and organizational learning in the peacekeeping context. And really the goal of evaluation, again, from my perspective, is to support organizational learning. And I think that's important in peacekeeping for all the factors that I mentioned earlier, but also because if you look at peacekeeping missions as an organization, they are extremely diverse. They, you know, have a UN appointed leadership, but they also have military component that are deployed by member states directly. They have police personnel, they have large civilian components, and all these have to work in integrated ways, coming from very different, you know, cultures, not just, you know, national cultures, but also military versus civilian cultures. And they have to do all these complex tasks in these sort of fast evolving settings. And if, from my perspective, if I lead on a lessons learned study, I see a big part of that is, if you look back at a response or something that went wrong, or if you want to evaluate or assess the performance, then the fact that during such a process, you bring all these different actors around the table to discuss together. They don't have to agree on everything, but they will come with their different views and their different reasons of why things were done a certain way, or why things went wrong, or what in their perspective was something that is a good practice, whereas from another perspective that didn't work at all. That's really where I feel like the learning happens, the learning takes place, and where you add value. And sometimes what I feel from my experience with evaluations, and again, the fact that there are a lot of them and that they're often done under, have to be done within a certain time frame, means that you might get a request for an interview by an evaluator, and you have a 1 hour conversation with this person, and a few weeks later or a few months later, you're presented with a draft report. And that's your opportunity to comment. Your comments have to often be focused on, sort of the factual accuracy, perhaps on whether a recommendation is feasible or not. And then the next thing you know is, again, a few months or weeks later, you get this long matrix where all the recommendations from the evaluations are neatly lined up. And then it becomes like, an action list with tasks that you have to implement, and that, are then regularly asked for, what's the status of this? What's the status of that? And this can really make evaluation into this sort of bureaucratic exercise. And as I explained earlier, from my perspective, organizational learning is about an evaluation or an assessment, a lesson, and then what happens with it, right? How is it implemented? But this kind of bureaucratization can make it so that kind of the essence, the lesson, may get a little lost, right? If that's the approach. And I know I saw in your research, Steffen, that actually in some organizations it may be done a little differently, and there are actually briefings to senior management to create that buy-in. And but I don't think that's necessarily always the case. And I think, again, if you want to think about how evaluations contribute to learning, then for me that's really another area that I think would be really interesting to look at, and the point of getting buy-in and getting the administration to think through what was the actual point of this evaluation, how are we actually going to use that to improve our operations. And sometimes that can get lost in the bureaucratic sort of way that we tend to then, the mechanisms that we establish to make it manageable, and with all the right reasons, right? It's so understandable that it's done in that way. But I think that's another sort of point of reflection that I have. And I think I'm going to stop here and hand it back to you, Benjamin, as I'm speaking for a while, but looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Brenda. This was fascinating as well to hear your thoughts and reflections on some of the empirical findings that Steffen has presented. A quick reminder to the audience to perhaps pose your question in the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. There's already like 3 or 4 questions that have come in. But before I turn to that, perhaps, Steffen, do you want to sort of respond directly to Brenda? Is there anything that you wanted to say in direct response before we turn it to the question and answer?
Yeah, maybe on that last point, Brenda, that you made. And I think this also relates to one of the questions that's already in the chat. So the second one by Ville. So he's also asking, so whether we've looked at the recommendations more systematically, to what degree they are remedial or uptaken of best practices under different control schemes. So more information on the recommendations, and we did look a little bit further than that, but not in the sense of that I have another few slides or systematic coding answers that I could show you. Rather anecdotal insights from the interviews that we conducted, and one of these or sort of reflects or very well what Brenda was just saying. We got the same sort of statements from our interviews, that very often these evaluations end up as sort of a long list of recommendations that are then thrown at the administration. Some organizations, evaluation units, have established mechanisms where they're following up. So there's really a reporting mechanism. They have a system online with green and red lights in terms of whether these evaluations are followed up. So some of the evaluations units are really following up on the recommendations and are implementing matrix schemes that check whether they end up being realized. But this is, I think, very much the sort of bureaucratic style that you were mentioning, Brenda, right? A long list of recommendations. It's a bureaucratic exercise of ticking boxes. And do we really learn with this? I mean, this was not the key question of the book. It was not a book about learning, but it was a book about, you know, where politics enter the whole game. And we did see they enter the game. And they did so specifically when either of the two actors had exclusive control over the unit. So when the other actor was kind of excluded from the discussion. And the best cases were organizations where we saw both. And I remember evaluation unit employees, but also people from the management, from the administration, saying that in these examples, there were evaluators who were really working hard with the management to design the evaluation. So they didn't come in only once and you could comment on the report, but they were sitting down through a couple of meetings, discussing with them what are feasible recommendations, how should the organization change. So it was more, you know, the process was more in the focus here. The process of designing the recommendations was not just a, you know, academic exercise of research and then we write down the recommendations, but they emphasized the process of producing these recommendations. And I think that's where the learning really took place. They were taking a lot of care whether recommendations are feasible, whether they can be implemented, what are the challenges down the road. And that is something that we could see mostly in these mixed evaluation systems. So just as the example quote that I've shown, they would talk to the administration, to the management, to people in the units they were looking at, but they were also talking to member states. And I do think that many of the evaluations that we see in practice are not designed for such a learning process. I've mentioned initially that there are some evaluations that cost €500,000 or US dollars, and others only $20,000-$30,000. And I think this, you know, the costs tell us something about whether these evaluations can be used for actual learning, because this costs staff time, right? Sitting down, going through all these meetings, designing the recommendations appropriately costs a lot of staff time. And if an evaluation is just designed to check on a project, whether this is implemented according to the terms of reference, then this is no real learning exercise. And I think there is still some development to be done. So maybe for those organizations that published a large number of evaluation reports, I mean, we as academics are happy about this. More data for us, what's happening in these organizations, that's great. But in terms of learning processes, I think that those organizations that are actually doing fewer evaluations, but then spend more money on every single one of them, do benefit more in terms of the actual learning experience. So that would be my, you know, short comment on your last point, Brenda, and maybe this the comment by Wille in the chat.
Great, thanks very much, Steffen. There is a couple other questions in the chat. My colleague Stephen Barani is saying, thanks for the excellent presentation and comments. Can either of you situate your the findings and experiences for Brenda compared to DAC's peer evaluation process, which can be politicized by host states in my Canadian experience? I don't know who wants to take the first shot, Brenda or Steffen?
I'm happy to give it a go. I'm not super familiar with the DAC's peer evaluation process, but maybe maybe coming at it also from the point of, for example, self-evaluation, which, as I mentioned, is just a fairly recent sort of new policy that at least our entities need to do that as well. I wouldn't. And I think, Steffen, you made in the conclusion a comment on that you know, could be problematic. And I would kind of want to nuance or be a bit more open towards that idea, because I do think when I mean, obviously, already from the point of the choice of topic of evaluation, where you leave it all in the hands of the entity itself. So of course you might miss out, but I think as a complementary sort of parts or like a tool because I do think that when entities do their own evaluation, the ownership is really with them. They own it. They probably do choose a topic that they know there is work to be done, and they can be, they can come up with they wouldn't do an evaluation just to show that, oh, the program went 100% perfect and we don't need to make any changes, and therefore, congratulations to us. So there is actually, I do think that, again, if you would look maybe more at this sort of qualitative aspects of those evaluations or the impact, that you might actually see that, well, there's a lot more sort of interest in entities to take forward the recommendations. And I'll then let Steffen respond maybe perhaps to the peer evaluation process, because I don't actually have practical experience with that. But I do want to say also, Steffen, in response to your remarks about sort of recommendations and the whole discussion about it being a bureaucratic process, what I also find is that a lot of evaluations or recommendations in evaluations tend to recommends there has to be policy, or there has to be guidance on this topic, because the reason that it went wrong was because there weren't any sort of standard procedures on how to manage this thing. And this is also something that, from having worked in this role, for now almost a decade, and I've seen a lot of sort of policies and guidelines being developed based on a recommendation from an evaluation or a report. And there's actually, but then you have a guideline, and then you actually need to go a step further and then ask the question, so how is this policy, how is this guideline, what's the uptake, how do people understand this, how do people do they know about it, do they read it, do they use it? So the recommendation doesn't end with the administration needs to provide guidelines or policy or whatever procedures on this topic. It, like, you really have to then go another step and see that. So for me, again, it's really, like, you have to look at this so holistically in order to be effective. Yeah, that was the point I want to make. Back to you, Benjamin.
Should I directly respond, or?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So now I have three thoughts on my mind. One in relation to Steffen's comment, and two in relation to what you said, Brenda. So Steffen, I think you're referring to the sort of the DAC peer review, where member state systems are evaluated by the other member states, right? What's happening in the context of the OECD, at least that's how I know these peer evaluations. And I've actually conducted research at the OECD as well. And the sort of gist of it is the same what we got out of the book. So they were basically quite empathic about the the presence of evaluation politics. What they told us about something very interesting. They said, if there's something like a politicized topic, or something that is a finding that is produced in by the evaluation report, there's typically a process of then drafting that report and putting pieces of evidence either on the front page in the executive summary, or burying it somewhere in the report. So what I got from that is actually the argument that no evidence is withheld, right? The reports are factfully. It's pretty much what we found also when we did our research on the large number of the reports. So people don't mess with the findings, right? But they do mess, or maybe rearrange the place where these findings are emphasized, whether they make it to the front page, whether they make it into a recommendation, or whether they're just somewhere in the 200 pages of the report. And this is something that happens to the DAX peer evaluation processes, and it happens to the evaluations that we looked at. This process that Brenda referred to of stakeholder commenting. So typically these evaluation reports are shared as a draft with all the stakeholders that are involved in the process, including member states and the administration. And this is, by the way, something that is similar across all systems, nothing specific to the sort of orientation of the unit that we found out. So this enables the stakeholders to come up with, emphasize whether some of the evidence is conflicted or not, and then it's just rearranged and put somewhere else in the reports. So that's maybe the one point. The other points about what you were saying, Brenda, I do think the kind of administrative-owned evaluations that are used for learning do exist. And maybe it's no surprise that you are saying this, because in the UN peace operation world, these evaluations are not published. Yeah, so they are kept secret. There are sort of internal documents. We have other organizations like the OSCE in Vienna. They have the same thing. They don't even share them with member states. So they do evaluations, but they're very secretive about it. And I agree that these are very helpful tools for the administration to reflect. But we have to see that evaluations are not only and exclusively there for learning. They're also instruments of transparency, and there are multiple demands that exist when it comes to the evaluation system. So as a researcher, as an academic, sitting at the outside, they're very helpful tools for us to understand what's happening in organizations, and also to come up with our recommendations. The kind of evidence that I was able to show today really depends on us being able to analyze these documents. And so therefore, I see this from two perspectives. One is sort of the academic and the sort of outside peer person who's dependent on some of the information being out there. And I think from a transparency and accountability perspective, it's therefore important that organizations do publish these reports. But I can see the desire for some organizations to, keep them secret. And I do agree that in these cases, it's maybe easier to learn from them than when, everything is published, what's written in these reports.
Thanks, Steffen. I want to turn to Jeremy. Jeremy is posing the following question. I'm just going to read it out to the audience. Thank you, Steffen, for your thoughtful contribution to the literature. Brenda, I'm a corporate analyst at Global Affairs Canada, and I'm looking to build an outcome reporting structure with evidence-based KPIs. In your own words, two questions. How should I individually be approaching management with suggestions as to outlining KPIs and outcome reporting without feeling as though I'm pointing the finger? And the second question, so there's a little tip that you may have from your experience. The second question, in your own experience, have there been any tools or methods that have helped you to push the needle, so to speak, in regards to advocating for good outcomes vis-a-vis rigid bureaucratic logics? Thank you in advance for your response. Perhaps, Brenda, do you want to start us off? And then I turn it back to Steffen.
Yeah, I think, that's almost, I'm almost thinking along the lines of change management, right? If you want to introduce a new tool for, in this case, KPIs, and I see, a lot of, I work in a division where a lot of the sort of policy initiatives start in the service that I work in, and they're often most successful if there is a sort of globally recognized problem or challenge that we all feel within peacekeeping we need to address, right? And then it's then about, and how do we then do that? So here I think you have the solution, evidence-based KPIs, but maybe just from the question, and of course there's a lot of information that I don't know here, but is sort of, is this solution, how did this come about? What is the problem that you're going to address with it, right? And is this a recognized problem within management? I think that's the point where you want to come, where you sort of want to target, or how you want to approach this is like, this is the solution that I have to this problem that we all recognized we have, and therefore this is how I think this will help us address this, for example, by better reporting, more transparency, more accountability. So that is sort of the lines along which I would be thinking in such a process. And then, yeah, pushing the needle, again, I feel a lot of, we're working in I think it doesn't really matter if it's within the UN or within a national administration. You know, we're civil servants, but also we're a little bit politicians as well, in that we need to understand, you know, who we're working with, how we can best address things, what are sort of, you know, how do we approach things? How do we, if we want to, you know, propose something, what's the best way of doing it? What's the best way of pushing the needle? So I really think it's very context specific, but it's really sort of understanding your context, your organization that you're in, and then finding key allies, right, or champions that want to move on that issue that you want to take forward, having them speak for you, you know, finding a couple of key directors that, you know, that others listen to is often a very helpful way of getting sort of broader buy-in and support for an issue. So it is really a little bit being the politician here and trying to sort of chart out a path of how you think you can, you can move things forward. But at the same time, also, we've heard it ourselves, like evaluations can also be a tool. If and I'm not arguing here for a completely politicized way of using evaluations, but if there is actually objective evidence out there to sort of move on a certain issue, then we should absolutely use that. So yeah.
Thank you, Brenda. And Jeremy, there's a few days that you have sort of to move the internal file a little bit. We won't be publishing the video for quite some time, for a week or so. So there's some regular room to work this through. Steffen, over to you.
Question was directed at Brenda. I can just say that maybe sort of the rigor of the evidence and the kind of methods that are used to collect the evidence might help. My experience is that sometimes the more qualitative evidence is more contested than when you crunch numbers and provide quantitative findings. So maybe that's just the short thought that I had about this pushing the needle. I think you can be sort of more frank when the evidence is difficult to contest. But I don't know the details of this particular case, but that would be my thought.
All right, excellent. I'm just looking at the time. We're actually about out of time. So let me perhaps close the webinar and start off by thanking both Brenda and Steffen for your very thoughtful, insightful, and very detailed presentations and your practical experiences with evaluations. Thank you also to the audience for being here, but also to pose some of those very thoughtful questions and probing questions. That was altogether was actually way more than we could have hoped for and that we had initially hoped for as an outcome for this webinar. So this was a very fantastic lunch event. Thank you again to both the audience and Steffen and Brenda. Thank you so much, and everybody have a great day. See you later. Bye-bye.